So we've learned that the Refugee Convention has 5 elements to it if we break it down into its constituent parts. We've got, first of all, a well-founded fear. That's the first requirement. You've got to have a well-founded fear of being persecuted. That's the second. It's got to be for one of 5 convention reasons, we call them. That's race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group, and lastly, political opinion. The last 2 elements are that you've got to be outside your country of origin, and lastly that you've got to be unable or unwilling to avail yourself of the protection of your home country. So that's the 5 elements that make up the Refugee Convention. As we'll see later though, some of those are interrelated, particularly being persecuted and the convention reasons. But I want to talk now about well-founded fear, and just to quickly go over some of what makes up a well-founded fear. So first of all, a well-founded fear is judged by an objective standard. So just because you're afraid of something doesn't mean that you've got a well-founded fear. Your fear or apprehension has to be a well-founded one that's got some objective basis in reality. The standard of proof in these cases is said to be a reasonable degree of likelihood or real risk, and that is basically a standard of proof that is lower than the civil standard, which is the balance of probabilities. The correct approach is said to be that of a case called Karen or Karen, which is not so much a strict standard of proof approach as one where a decision maker has to evaluate all of the available evidence and then only discard evidence to which the decision maker is willing to attach no credence at all. So everything else has to be considered and appropriate weight attached to it, and only that to which you're not willing to attach any credence at all should be discarded. So most things should be considered in the round. One of the key elements to a well-founded fear in many refugee claims, and this is one of the key reasons why a refugee claim might fail, is that the refugee has to show they're telling the truth, basically, and that what happened to them in the past is actually true, and therefore that they've got a future fear in future. So there are different tools that decision makers use to try and assess credibility, because unfortunately refugees, when they flee, they're not able to take documentary proof with them. What's happened to them individually often won't be recorded in news reports or anything like that. So all they've got quite often is their own testimony. And the tools used for analysing that testimony are firstly to look at whether the refugee, the asylum seeker, has been consistent in the way that they give their account. So if they're going over the account on a single occasion, then perhaps is something they've said at the beginning of the account inconsistent with something they've said later, or if they've given their account on multiple occasions, which is often the case with the asylum process in the UK, then are there differences between what they've said on those different occasions. Another classic tool that's used to assess credibility, it's often called whether you're telling the truth, is plausibility. Is what you say plausible? Does it match with the country information? Is that kind of thing happening in the country of origin? Plausibility is often wrongly used by decision makers in the sense that they will assess whether something is plausible judged against their own beliefs or their own standards of experience, and that's not a very safe way of determining refugee status applications, because improbable things happen all the time basically, and most of us in the safety of the UK haven't experienced some of the horrors, frankly, that refugees will have experienced, and so our ability to judge what is plausible or not is somewhat questionable really in that context. One of the other tools, and these are perhaps moving on to things that are even less reliable than plausibility as an assessment tool, types of behaviour by refugees. There are some types of behaviour that are generally considered to be damaging to credibility, to undermine the refugee's account. And for example, travelling through safe third countries is often taken to suggest that a person isn't a genuine refugee, even though there is just no research, no evidence to suggest that a genuine refugee will claim asylum in the first country that they reach. And also things like late claims for asylum, that's often taken to be a sign that somebody doesn't really require protection, and that basically it'll be said that they're trying it on in order to prevent themselves from being removed, when the truth is that many refugees have experienced real trauma and sometimes horrendous things, and they just don't want to talk about that. They don't want to approach the authorities in an asylum country to talk about these things and disclose these things because they're afraid, and they just don't want to disclose that kind of thing. It's deeply personal to them. So again, late claims for asylum is not a terribly good way of assessing credibility. We also know that the Refugee Convention is quite a forward-looking instrument. So it's not simply about harm that a person has suffered in the past and then being sort of rewarded with sanctuary for having experienced that suffering. It's about protecting somebody from something happening to them in the future. Now, past experiences are going to be relevant to that, so not least whether you're telling the truth about what happened in the past. If you're not telling the truth, then it's going to be hard, generally speaking, to prove that you're going to be in danger in the future. But also in the sense that past experience is relevant because if something's already happened to you, then unless there's been a change of circumstances, there's a good chance that that will happen to you again in the future and it will be repeated, unless there has been, for example, a change of government or something of that nature. We also have to look at the country information when looking at future risks. So that's one of the most important parts of the refugee status determination process, is looking at available country information, human rights reports, press reports, that kind of thing, to assess not just whether things might have happened in the past as claimed, but also what's happening now on the ground, and is there danger for somebody who fits the profile of the refugee. And again, that leads us on to another point, which is to look for individual risk factors, certain characteristics that the refugee might have that might expose them to more or less harm. In some cases, behaviour in the UK might be relevant. So, for example, if a person's been attending protests or demonstrations in the UK, that's a sign that could be taken as a sign that they're a genuine committed activist, or it could be that they're trying it on, or it could even be that those kind of protests outside embassies and things are being filmed, and that information is being conveyed back to the authorities of the home state. Lastly, on well-founded fear, there's also in refugee claims now understood to be looking to the future, the question of how the refugee might behave in the event of a hypothetical return. So if, for example, you're a political activist, would you expose yourself to danger, or would you have to button up and keep quiet? If you are gay, would you have to be discreet if you're returned, or would you expose yourself to danger? And with both those examples, the law is now that either way you're a refugee, basically, but the question of how you might want to behave in future is something that can be important now in modern refugee status determination.